Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, December 14th, 2022. All right, folks. The first story at the top of antiwar.com today is not a good one. Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, withdrew his request to hold a vote on the Yemen War Powers Resolution because the Biden administration came out against this resolution. So this was on Tuesday night. There was this vote scheduled to happen at 7 p.m. And this resolution would end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war and blockade on Yemen. But Bernie Sanders caved in to pressure from the White House. Sanders said on the Senate floor that he was informed ahead of the scheduled vote of the administration's opposition to the legislation. And that means that the White House threatened that President Biden would veto it if it reached his desk. And The Intercept, Ryan Grimm from The Intercept, he reported earlier in the day that the White House was pressuring senators to vote against the bill. So when I saw that, that was pretty disheartening. And then after that, some Democrats came out in opposition to Sanders's resolution earlier, before the vote, including Senator Alex Padilla. He's a senator in California. So Sanders, his justification for not holding the vote was that the administration claimed that it would work with Congress on ending the war in Yemen. He said the White House wanted to work with Congress on crafting language that would be mutually acceptable. And Sanders insisted that if that did not happen, he would resume his efforts to end the war through a resolution. He would introduce another resolution. So, I mean, the big issue there is that, if the White House was really serious about ending this war, it would support the resolution. It's just nonsense, this idea that they want to work with Congress to end it. And notice what he said there. They want to craft the language, basically meaning they want to water down the resolution, giving Biden a nice big loophole where he would be able to just continue supporting the coalition in Yemen anyway. And, the big thing here is that, okay, let's say in some fantasy world, the White House and Bernie Sanders come to this great agreement to really end U.S. support for the war in Yemen. It's going to take a while if that happens. And if Sanders isn't happy, I mean, I don't expect him to. This shows he's not going to do anything against the Biden administration. It shows he's just totally caved to the pressure. But let's say, something changed and he did reintroduce the legislation. This is going to take lots of time. The Congress, this session is just about over. He would have to reintroduce it, get more co-sponsors. All the activist groups would have to start telling people to call their senators and stuff. But this all takes time, and Yemenis don't have time. So there's been a huge cessation in violence in Yemen, which is very good. There's been no Saudi airstrikes since March, but the issue is that there's been a recent uptick in fighting on the ground. It's getting pretty hairy on the ground. And the ceasefire expired in October, and without a real peace deal, the war could flare up again really at any time. So the resolution could have ended U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition, including maintenance of its warplanes, which would effectively ground the Saudi Air Force. So if the resolution was passed and Biden didn't veto it, just that alone would put pressure on the Saudis to really just sign a peace deal, a real lasting peace deal with the Houthis. And even if Biden did veto the resolution, sending it through Congress would have sent a message to the White House, and it would have sent a message to Riyadh. But instead they caved. And it's just really pathetic because the reason why I was hopeful about this, and I told people to call their senators, and a few people told me they did, because I was putting the word out there. So, I appreciate that people did that. I did it again myself today. I called Senator Tim Kaine and Mark Warner from Virginia, and their staff both told me, oh, yeah, we got a lot of calls about this today. So I was hopeful. And then I saw that thing from Ryan Grimm that the White House was out there working against it. And I realized, this probably wasn't going to happen. But this comes after the Biden administration. All these Democrats are saying that they're all mad at Saudi Arabia. We got to do something. So, I mean, that's why I was hopeful about it, but they haven't done anything. And I doubt they're really going to do anything tangible. So while Democrats started to fold in their support for the resolution on Tuesday, two Republicans came out in favor of it, Rand Paul and Mike Lee. But, I mean, I don't know if any other Republicans would have voted for it. I mean, but you have to hold the vote. I mean, it's just, now we don't know. I mean, it's just pathetic. And, um, Rand Paul and Mike Lee, they should have been co-sponsors. That's another issue, is that it was just Democrat co-sponsors. Rand Paul and Mike Lee have co-sponsored similar legislation years ago. So, why not this time? Why weren't they out there leading the charge on this? I don't get it. They want to be opposition to Biden. It's a good way to do it. And then in the House, there's a version that was also introduced, and it gained 118 co-sponsors, including 10 Republicans. So there's some Republican support there. I know the co-sponsors include, Thomas Massie, Marguerite Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Andy Biggs, Nancy Mace. Is that her name? So people, that's good, but I mean, there's not going to be a vote there. And even if there is, obviously the Senate, it's just not going to happen now. So I just give a little background in this article for, if people are reading this that don't know too much about it. And just the fact that the U.S. first intervened to back the Saudi UAE-led coalition in Yemen against the Houthis in 2015. And a few months prior to that, the Obama administration was sharing intelligence with the Houthis as part of their effort against al-Qaeda. So January, I linked to a Wall Street Journal article from January 2015 that says that the U.S. is forging ties with the Houthis. The Houthis are helping them fight al-Qaeda. Not even 2 months later, I believe it was March 25th, that the Obama White House put out a statement and said that they were backing the Gulf intervention in Yemen. And since then, the U.S.-backed coalition has recruited al-Qaeda fighters. I linked to an article, a report from AP in 2018 on that. That really details how, the U.S. coalition has al-Qaeda as their fighters on the ground against the Houthis. And U.S. arms, of course, ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda. I linked to a very detailed report from CNN from 2019 about that. So that's kind of the talking point. If you want to convince these more Republicans to get on board, as Scott Horton always says, it's a war for al-Qaeda, pretty much. And according to UN estimates, by the end of 2021, at least 377,000 people have been killed in the war. Considered a very low estimate. The UN said about 150,000 of those people died in violence, while the rest were killed by starvation and disease caused by the war and blockade on the country. And the U.S.-backed coalition is notorious for bombing civilians. And civilian casualties spiked earlier this year, right before the ceasefire was reached in March, right when Russia was invading Ukraine. It really showed the hypocrisy of the U.S. for still backing this war. But anyway, I hope I didn't go on too long there. It's just background information for people that might not know. And again, I linked to all this stuff in the article, but it's just a real shame. Okay, so the next article here, the U.S. is expected to provide Ukraine with Patriot missile systems. So Reuters reported on Tuesday, as well as it was all over the place. I saw a bunch of media outlets report this, that the U.S. is finalizing plans to send Raytheon-made Patriot air defense missile systems to Ukraine. And the decision could be announced by the Biden administration this week. Sending the Patriots would mark a significant escalation in U.S. military aid, as the missiles are considered to be one of the more advanced U.S.-made air defense systems. A lot of U.S. allies purchased them. They're in high demand, short supply, but it looks like they're going to find some for Ukraine. So the plan to send the Patriots to Kiev comes as Russian missile strikes have been pounding Ukrainian infrastructure, and Biden just spoke with Zelensky the other day and said that the U.S. would provide more air defense support. And if the U.S. does provide the system, Ukrainian soldiers would likely be trained on how to use them in Germany. That's where the U.S. has been training a lot of Ukrainian soldiers, and they have plans to really increase that training. U.S. officials told Reuters that the announcement could be made as soon as Thursday, and the decision is just awaiting the approval of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who is a former Raytheon board member. Russia has previously warned NATO against sending Patriot systems to Ukraine, and would view the move as an escalation of U.S. involvement in the war. Dmitry Medvedev, he's a former Russian president, and he's currently the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. He said that the Patriot systems and any NATO personnel that are sent into Ukraine would become legitimate targets for Russia's armed forces. So, more aid for Ukraine, of course. And then the next one here is Slovakia prepares to transfer MiG-29 warplanes to Ukraine. So Slovakia's foreign minister said this on Tuesday, that the country is preparing to send its Soviet-era MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. And this would mark the first known transfer of warplanes to Kiev from a NATO member. I said known transfer there because I wouldn't be surprised if, say, Poland or another Eastern European country, did it on the down low, sent some of these planes, because these are the planes that Ukrainian pilots know how to use, so they don't need training. So Slovakia's foreign minister said they haven't given them the MiG-29s yet. They've been talking about this for months, but they're saying that they're ready to do it and that they're talking to their NATO partners about how to do it. He said that Slovakia had a conversation with Zelensky about the potential transfer, and that he expects a visit from a Ukrainian delegation, and that Slovakia is going to work together with the U.S. to make this a reality. So Slovakia says that it has 11 MiG-29s. It's not clear how many of them they're going to send. So it's not that much, but still, it is significant. Earlier in the war, if you remember, I believe this was way back in May, Poland said it was ready to give its MiGs to Ukraine. But it was really strange the way it happened. If I remember correctly, the U.S. said, yeah, Poland, give them your MiG-29s. And I think Poland was worried more about escalation back then. Of course, they've been very gung-ho about supporting Ukraine now, suggesting all sorts of crazy things. But then they were a little more cautious. And then I think they weren't happy that the U.S. said that publicly, because then they said, yeah, okay, U.S., we'll send them to one of your bases in Germany, and then you can send them to Ukraine. And then the Pentagon said, nah, that's not a good idea. So it didn't happen. So Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials, they've been pleading with the West to send more. This probably isn't going to be good enough for Zelensky. He wants more advanced modern aircraft, but the U.S. has yet to oblige. Ukraine says that it's seeking F-16s. They've been really lobbying hard for this, sending Ukrainian pilots to Washington. But these planes would take months to train Ukrainian pilots how to fly. But again, the U.S. has big plans to step up its training. They're setting up a whole command in Germany, and that command is going to oversee arming Ukraine and training Ukrainian soldiers. Just gives you an idea of where their head is at. That's another thing. I mean, my optimism about the increased U.S.-Russian dialogue, engagement, chance for peace talks, that's gone away too. So sorry if this is a depressing episode. Where was I? And of course, if the U.S. started sending F-16s, really equipping them with super advanced planes like that, of course, Russia would view that as another major escalation. So we're just climbing the escalatory ladder as we go. Okay, so the next one, a group of about 70 countries on Tuesday pledged over $1 billion in new aid for Ukraine at a donor conference in Paris. And that includes about $440 million to help repair the country's energy infrastructure. So according to France's foreign minister, the remaining funds, which is over $500 million, will go towards Ukraine's water, transportation, health, and food sectors. So this pledge came after Ukraine's Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal. He said that Ukraine would need $1 billion just to repair Ukraine's power grid and heating systems. So the money for the energy infrastructure is much lower than what he said that they need. And Zelensky, he addressed this donor conference via video link, and he put the price tag a little lower than what his prime minister said. He said that Ukraine needs about $850 million for energy repairs. But I mean, either way, even if they get this funding, Ukraine's energy infrastructure is in really bad shape. They say half of the their infrastructure facilities have been damaged. Millions of Ukrainians are without power and heat. And as they're trying to repair, Russia's still, bombing them. And it's just a really bad situation. And you still, in the West, you have this narrative that, Ukraine is winning when civilians, it's just such a bad situation for them. But even if, sorry, I missed my spot here. And the Russian strikes, they're going to likely persist as Ukraine is stepping up attacks inside Russia. So, yeah, I mean, that's really it for this story, is that they got some new aid. The next one here, more aid for Ukraine. This is the fourth article about Ukraine getting something. So the EU and Hungary reach a deal on sending Ukraine 18 billion euros. Hungary on Tuesday lifted its objection to the European Union sending 18 billion euros to Ukraine after reaching a deal with the EU on funds that Brussels wants to block from Hungary. So the EU was looking to deny the Hungarian government of Viktor Orban 7.5 billion euros in EU funding over allegations of corruption, or whatever they call it. They're saying that Hungary's democracy is backsliding, and they said this after Orban won re-election back in April. But so under this deal that was reached, the EU will free up 1.2 billion euros for Hungary, but the remaining 6.3 won't be released until the EU's European Commission is happy with the reforms that it wants Hungary to make. So this 18 billion euros for Ukraine is expected to help cover Ukraine's massive $38 billion budget deficit for 2023. When Hungary initially blocked the funds, it said it was opposed to the way the EU planned to send the aid, which is apparently the way that they're going to do this is that all 27 EU members are going to jointly borrow the 18 billion euros. Hungary said they didn't like that. But, now it's clear they were using this as leverage to get some EU funds unlocked. So Hungary's also been holding out on approving Sweden and Finland's NATO bids, but Orban insists that they do support the membership. And his chief of staff said this week that Hungary's parliament is going to begin debating the ratification of the two Nordic nations joining NATO on February 20th. Hungary and Turkey are the only two countries that haven't approved of Sweden and Finland joining the alliance. Turkey, as I've covered a lot, they're trying to get a lot of concessions out of Finland and Sweden from this deal that they signed to get them to join NATO. And I don't see them approving it anytime soon. I mean, they're really dragging it out. Hopefully, they never make Erdogan happy enough to approve them joining NATO. And I mean, really what it's going to take for them is to just extradite a bunch of Kurds that went to Sweden and Finland for asylum from Turkey. All right, the next article here, China sends 18 bombers into Taiwan's ADIZ. So Taiwan's defense ministry on Tuesday reported that 29 Chinese People's Liberation Army, that's the PLA, that's the abbreviation for the Chinese military, 29 PLA aircraft flew into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, including 18 H-6 bombers. So what is an ADIZ, you ask? It's an area where a country requires foreign aircraft to identify itself, but the concept is not covered under any international treaties and has no international regulations. So the U.S. set these up back I think maybe in the 1950s. They set up what they called the Air Defense Identification Zone for Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and I believe the Philippines as well. And Taiwan, if you look at the map here, Taiwan actually claims an ADIZ that goes well over mainland China. But they, obviously they don't report Chinese military activity in that area. But for a while, these flights, Chinese flights in this ADIZ were really misrepresented in Western media for a while. You would see headlines that would say Chinese warplanes, fly into Taiwan's airspace, which is not what an ADIZ is. An airspace is 12 nautical miles off of a country's territory. So it would be 12 nautical miles off of Taiwan. and that hasn't happened. And if you're looking at the map again, so the ADIZ is pretty big, and for a while before Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan and China really stepped up its military activity, they kept the flights to this southwest corner of the ADIZ, which is really closer to mainland China than Taiwan. So it was really hyped up by Western media. At the same time, China knows it's going to be hyped up, and they have increased their military activity in the area. But so anyway, so the bombers flew in that area, but 18 bombers. I mean, that is a lot of bombers. And it represents, while they didn't fly anywhere near the island, it does represent the uptick in Chinese military activity in the region since Pelosi visited in August. And according to the South China Morning Post, the sorties marked a record high number of Chinese bombers in the area since Taiwan began releasing daily updates on Chinese military activity in the region back in September 2020. September 2020 was kind of a pivotal time because in August 2020 and September 2020, the Trump administration, Trump sent his health secretary to Taiwan in August, and then he sent an undersecretary for economic affairs, I believe. Might not sound that significant, but they were the highest level cabinet officials, U.S. cabinet officials, to visit Taiwan since 1979. That's when China kind of increased its military activity in this area. And Taiwan's defense ministry began publishing these just about every day. And that's when it started grabbing the headlines. And of course, all the context is missing that China's activity is all a response to U.S. support for Taiwan. And since Pelosi visited Taiwan, China has been sending planes over the median line, which is the unofficial barrier that separates the Taiwan Strait. And this is a release from December 7th that shows Chinese planes went over the median line. So this keeps happening regularly. China used to never cross that line. Very rarely they did, but that has changed since Nancy Pelosi visited. And tensions between the U.S. and China are set to rise further as unprecedented military aid for Taiwan is included in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. Okay, so the next one here, China and India. So there was a little brawl between Chinese and Indian soldiers up in the Western Himalayas along their disputed border. So the Chinese and Indian troops that are stationed in this area, I forget what they call it, the line of actual control or something. But it's a disputed area, and the Chinese and Indian troops that are there, they're not armed with guns. And so when they get, once in a while, skirmishes do break out, but they either fight with their fists or sticks. And there was actually a pretty serious one back in the summer of 2020, and I believe 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and a handful of Chinese soldiers were killed. And that was the biggest outbreak of violence, I mean, maybe in decades, between the two militaries. So since then, China and India have been in pretty intense talks over this area, and they've pulled back from certain areas, but they're also building up in other areas. So anyway, there was another clash last week that left soldiers on both sides with minor injuries. And this article is just saying that China and India are at odds over what they say caused the fight. And that's usually the case because, they say, oh, the Chinese troops, they entered this area that they weren't supposed to be in. And then China says, no, the Indian troops entered this area because it's a very disputed border. So who knows what the situation with that, but it's just something I just want to make people aware of it because, I think China and India are very uninterested in fighting a war. And I don't think these clashes are going to lead to a war anytime soon. But I mean, it is always a possibility, I guess. And they're two major nuclear powers with the biggest populations in the world. So it would be a disaster if that ever happened. One thing that happened after the summer 2020 clash, the U.S. really increased military cooperation with India, and they signed a military deal to give India access to its satellites and data like that. And this, according to U.S. military officials, means that the U.S. is helping India track Chinese troops on this border. And when this deal was signed, Indian media was saying, oh, this is going to help us if we ever need to launch drone strikes or missile strikes, we could get these coordinates from the U.S. This is great. So, I mean, the U.S. is, if a war breaks out or a small battle or something, the U.S. is going to be involved with this cooperation that they signed with India. So that's another reason why I think it's something for us to keep an eye on. All right, the last news story here. So this is an interesting story. It's from Middle East Eye, and it's titled, "Don't Like Sudan's New Political Deal? The U.S. May Ban You." And this really just shows, the Biden administration's, just how they operate. So pretty much what happened here is that, there was a coup in Sudan, and there was a power sharing agreement between the Sudanese military and some civilian political groups that the U.S. backs. The U.S. says, yeah, make this deal. So Antony Blinken has threatened the Secretary of State that any spoilers of this deal would be hit with visa restrictions, would be hit with sanctions. So this was a pact to rescue Sudan's democratic transition after the 2021 military coup. That's what the U.S. says. But it didn't matter that the deal had little popular support and had been outright rejected by many key players in Sudan. So it's not a popular deal, but you have Blinken here threatening sanctions. He said, quote, "Just as we used our prior visa restrictions policy against those who undermined the former civilian-led transitional government, we will not hesitate to use our expanded policy against spoilers in Sudan's democratic transition process," end quote. So it's not clear. This article says it's not clear whether the threat will prompt Sudan, the people that are against the deal, to toe the line if they're really going to care about, U.S. sanctions. But for the Sudanese already dissatisfied with the agreement and Washington's role in it, this latest intervention is only adding to the outrage. So again, it just shows how they operate. They just want to use force in every situation, and it just ends up making more people bitter and hostile to the U.S. But that's it for the news today, and we have some great viewpoints that you should go check out. One from Daniel Larison over at his Substack, "Beware the fake solidarity of Iran hawks." So you have all these Iran hawks now with the protests saying that they stand with the Iranian people, but they also favor policies that are really hurting them, the economic sanctions. So go check that out. We have one from Barbara Slavin. "When will the U.S. learn?" This is over at Responsible Statecraft. "When will the U.S. learn that sanctions don't solve its problems?" And, just think about that Sudan thing I just went over. But you can just list the countries as she does here. Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, Syria, and North Korea. What have sanctions accomplished there? When it comes to the U.S.'s stated goals, I find it hard to believe that they're not just imposing sanctions to punish people and countries, because it's clear that that's what happens. One from Jacob Hornberger over at the Future Freedom Foundation. "We must not forget the U.S. war on Afghanistan." So this is about, just the failure of the lessons and stuff that we need to learn about the failure in Afghanistan. One from Ryan McMacken over at the Mises Institute about the Pentagon failing another audit. So go read all that stuff. You can support the show, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Share it around. Tell your friends. That's it for me for today. Sorry, it's usually bad news, and today was especially bad. But, hopefully, I don't know, some things change. And maybe it motivates more people to get involved with, the Yemen activism, because there is a pretty huge group of very solid activists in DC that, if it wasn't for them, these resolutions wouldn't have been introduced in the first place. So, they're not going to give up. But anyway, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.